Regulation, favourite subject of many. We've got a couple of people on the panel who work in highly regulated areas. We've got finance, gaming, insurance, all of those areas. I've worked in some pretty regulated areas as well. Lot of conversation on there at the moment about tech first companies, you know, the Facebooks and the Amazons of this world, and heavily regulating them in different areas. You know, are we getting this right in our industry? Are we getting the balance of regulations right? Should we be suppressing technology? Does it crush innovation? Don't know. Sticking with you, Richard, you know, you're in a highly regulated industry in the banking world. What's your feeling about regulation and how we need to balance it out?
Yeah, I guess my first point would be I'm not sure is tech itself is not really an industry, is my view. It's a skill set. I mean, most tech companies are working in a industry that often had a traditional element to it. So, Amazon clearly retailing, or on-premise data centers, I guess, if you want to go that way as well. Deliveroo, your local restaurants for takeaway. So, I mean, I think generally the regulation is going to be often shaped by what the incumbent sector looked like. It's fair to say. And I mean, financial services, there's lots of regulation, and having worked at Revolut, that was very, very tech first company, but for sure had to comply with regulations in the US, and Singapore, in Australia, in Lithuania, in Romania, in all around the world, and you've got to be able to apply both. And I think the ability for companies in highly regulated industries to get that into their DNA as almost code, as opposed to paper-based processes for compliance, is really important. But the more general point I'd make here, though, is one of I think that the thing that irks me with some of the big tech, and where I think there is a need for regulation, and GDPR has gone a little way here, but I personally kind of, for me, data is the customers. And a lot of companies build their model around monetizing customer data. That, in my view, is just not theirs, and is not generally passportable. So, as part of the introduction of open banking in the UK, which was about making bank transactional data portable, which historically was a incumbent barrier, right, that got used to block competition. So, I personally would say, forcing open data across in all industries is generally a very good thing in my view. And yes, that'll force a lot of change in business model, but I think that is, those business models are bad if they rely on exploiting private customer data.
Okay, all right. Azita, what do you think about that?
So I'm seeing that from a different perspective. We have, when it comes to, completely agree with Richard that technology is not a kind of company or business. It is actually as enabler. Enabler to deliver food, enabler to share information, and so on. And the digital native organizations, GAFAM Group and Alibaba's and so on, we see the economic growth that they have had is being based on using data and personal data, and is their practices that has been known to us in the last few years through whistleblowing activities rather than a transparency from them. So if any regulation is in there, an example is the Cambridge Analytica and the effect that it had on democratic process of election, for instance. And regulatory bodies are struggling. Normally, they are behind the digital innovation and technology innovation. And they can regulate something that they understand. And the nature of these businesses has been very shape-shifting, going from connecting students at the campus to being the largest information sharing platform around the globe. So I believe that the incremental regulation and incremental changes will help rather than sit and wait to be able to define what these platforms are. Are they utilities like electricity that anybody can use, or they are what is the nature of them? And in the market, I've seen the most recent and best approach has been in Australia. Australian government has imposed on these platforms a regulation around publishing news and charging them for doing that. The reason for that is really the pressure from the business and from the news corporations. However, there is no champion, there hasn't been any champion about public data, because these companies have been building empires on back of personal data through selling ads and so on. So one good approach would be that taking the Australian model, but go in a step further with focus on usage of personal data. So as our data being used and ads being sold to us, how about enabling a mechanism that every time my data is used, a kickback from that revenue is coming back to me as an individual? And that will create a more careful approach to their practices in terms of how they use personal data and citizen data, and also can create a negative source of income for every single citizen that their data being used for an economic growth of these businesses.
I think that's, I mean, it's quite revolutionary to sort of say, right, well, we're going to use all your data and we're going to give you a kickback for it. But I quite like the idea. And I think there is a lot of people out there who'll be like, yeah, fine, I'm up for that. I mean, there'll probably a little micro industry will be created out of it. And a bit like when eBay first came along, people will start running businesses saying, I just sell my opinions all the time. So that's interesting. Maria, from where is regulation a good thing? Where does it foster opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think to your point earlier, it's about the balance. It's like what type of regulation can be helpful. I think, as Richard mentioned, open banking in Europe has actually enabled a lot of innovation. I think one thing we've seen in the US is that, some of the regulation makes it difficult to make certain innovations in the financial sector. And there's certain sectors like, I've invested in crypto and Bitcoin companies, and a lot of those founders have told me over the years that like having an absence of regulation is actually much worse than having no regulation, because if you don't even know where the lines are, you don't know where to color. And so if you have constraints, you can figure out how to build it around that. But if you don't even know what they are, it's and it is real, right? I mean, in the run up in 2017, people were wondering if they would go to jail if they did an ICO. Like, there's real personal and technology implications if you don't have, in the absence of regulation in general. And I think, to Azita's point, it's also just about getting people informed, right? There needs to be a lot more channels between who's building and the regulators, because it often feels like they're a bit behind, right? I think a lot of people probably followed like the Facebook capital conversations and just felt like the questions that were being asked were very, very basic. And I think that, but there's other great examples where regulators really are on top of it. And it's not even about balance for industry. It's also about balance for size of company. Like one of the DA, there's an organization in New York that regulates financial services, and they put out this edict that everyone has to have a security officer. So aside from a CTO, you have to have a CISO. That can't be the same person. And that affects a large bank very differently than it affects a 12-person company. And so I think it's also important to think about like what regulation is appropriate for all different size companies.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, one of the key things is that regulatory bodies need to be working more with the businesses, because the regulation can't keep up with the speed of change of technology. And that's where you get, legislation or regulatory guidance and governance coming out, which then appears to be 12 months out of date, because technology has moved on so fast and the data's moved on so fast and everything around it. They just can't keep up with the pace. So I think a lot more communication with different size or different tiers of organization is key, because you're absolutely right. Not every organization can afford, a CISO and then, a data protection officer and then a CIO or a CTO, whatever it may be. So I think those communication channels are absolutely critical.
And I think that's sort of part of the point that Azita was making, yeah, about the regulators can't keep up. So what happens, in my experience, we sell alcohol, we work in a highly regulated world, and we've got GDPR in the UK and Europe, we've got the Australian Privacy Act, and then in, the most substantial one is America's CCPA in California, but then all the other states have a variant as well, right? Yeah. It's really difficult to keep up with. And we find that, therefore, we get this broad brush mandate come down to us, and it's just totally off whack. It's unnecessary. So if we were more engaged and being proactive and maybe, dare I say it, offering up what reasonable regulation looks like, then that might make that path easier, as you're saying, Tony.
Absolutely. And then otherwise it becomes open to interpretation, and then no one ever gets anything right because your view is different from somebody else's view. And then that's where, you know, you get a lot of debate, especially, you know, around what was DPA and things like that.
Philip Wiggs chipped in with a question here. Thank you, Philip, saying, linking this question to the last one, which is very clever, you should be a panelist leader. Bitcoin has a carbon footprint comparable to that of New Zealand. Is there regulation needed there? Anybody got any views on that?
I will find a link in a second and put it in the chat to everyone. I mean, it's a huge concern. So I am worried about it, and I think there needs to be thoughtfulness around that. There is also someone I know who has a contrarian view. To be fair, I don't know what the view is yet, so I'm not really backing it, but you should follow her because she has an interesting case for why she thinks it's actually not affecting climate change as much as other people think it is. But from my perspective so far, I do think that the mining and the compute power is just insane. And so there needs to be thoughtfulness around how to move forward with that for sure.